welcome back to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I'm the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics. Listen, I thought I'd record another quick podcast just with a few thoughts on the new state budget, the new proposed state budget that Ron DeSantis rolled out earlier this week. And listen, on one level, this is kind of a dumb exercise. The governor's budget is basically worthless the moment he rolls it out. He's legally required to recommend a budget to the state legislature, but it's the state legislature that actually writes it and passes it, right? And they can ignore the governor's budget completely if they wanted to. There's no like legally binding thing that the governor does that the legislature has to follow here. So, A, it means the document has no real sort of legal meaning, but B, it also allows the governor to do a bunch of just fundamentally unserious stuff because he knows this budget isn't worth the paper it's printed on, right? And so to give you just one example of what I mean by this, the governor will make a big deal about how his budget overall is smaller than the last year's budget. But he does that. He's able to do that because he takes advantage of a bunch of accounting gimmicks that he couldn't get away with if he was passing like a real state budget. Just to give you one quick sort of illustration of this, the state of Florida operates on a July to June fiscal year, July 1st to June 30th every year. And so Ron DeSantis is rolling out a budget for the July 2025 to June 2026 fiscal year right now. But he's doing this right now. We're sitting here in February of 2025. And so what he will do in his proposed budget is he'll stuff hundreds of millions of dollars, more than $1 billion of spending into the current year, money that would, if this were law, would get rushed out the door before June, right? And so it all goes into the current year budget and stays out of the new state one, the one he's allegedly rolling out here. So this is how he's able to claim, like, I've got $500 million of money in here for immigration enforcement, and yet I'm reducing spending overall. It's just accounting gimmicks. That's all this is. But, with all that said, the governor's budget is a pretty clear and tangible reflection of his priorities, right? Anytime a politician has to write a budget, you get a real clear sense of what are the things they really care about, what they want to focus on, they want you to focus on. And so analyzing it from that respect, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor. And so when you look at the budget that Ron DeSantis rolls out, I think for me, the big takeaway is that Ron DeSantis wants to run a nanny state. Listen, this is not just about, consolidating power in his office and expanding the governor's authority, which, I would argue that has been the central and most consistent theme and through line of Ron DeSantis's 6+ years as Florida's governor. I mean, it is partially that, but this time it's more about he's trying to turn himself into essentially Florida's morality cop, a guy who makes personal decisions for you, who makes decisions about what you can watch and what you can learn, and even potentially what you can vote on, what issues you can vote on. So let me walk you through a bit of what I mean, and you'll see what I'm basing this on. But to do this, let's start by dialing things back a year or so to when the governor signed last year's state budget. And so in Florida, governors have what's known as a line item veto. That means they can go through a state budget and strike out individual projects and earmarks and individual sections from the budget before signing it. It's a really powerful tool for a governor to have. Presidents do not have this power, no matter how much Donald Trump seems to be trying to invent it right now through impoundment. But that's for another podcast to dive into. Anyway, so last year when Ron DeSantis signed last year's state budget, one of the things he vetoed was essentially the state's entire arts and cultural budget. Basically more than $30 million for arts and cultural and museum programs and museums around the state, just killed it out completely. This was, you might not be surprised to learn, this prompted a lot of outrage. And not just in sort of Democratic cities either, by the way. There are a lot of Republican areas around the state with vibrant arts communities. Sarasota comes to mind as an example of that. And people were furious that the governor would just kill out funding for all arts and culture like this. And at the time, it wasn't really clear why he did it or whether or not he even gave much thought to it. The governor went like several days, if memory serves, went several days without answering or addressing any questions about this. And, and just to the point I made earlier about sometimes the governor is fundamentally unserious about a lot of this stuff. A lot of times all he cares about is the top line number that he can send out in a press release or talk about in a speech, right? And so he actually talked about this earlier this week when he was rolling out this year's budget. He was giving his answering questions from reporters. He even talked about he doesn't even much care about what he's vetoing. He just wants to get to a point where he can say, for instance, I vetoed $1 billion. He wants to hit $1 billion, or he wants to say that this year's budget is less than last year's, right? The actual sort of mechanics of how he gets there seems to be unimportant to him, which if you kind of unpack that, that's an insane way to go about governing. Listen, if there is, if there's a bunch of waste and fraud and stuff in the budget and a lot of fat that you think you can kill it out. And you shouldn't stop killing it out just because you hit the number you want to cite in a press release headline, right? By the same token, if this is valuable stuff, this is important stuff, this is stuff that people rely on or helps people or improves the communities or improves the economy, you shouldn't kill it out just because you want to be able to look like a badass on the stump, But anyway, it wasn't clear at the time whether or not he put a lot of thought into it. But after a few days of controversy, he eventually finally addressed this. And he claimed that he vetoed it because a part of this funding, a very tiny fraction, was going to go to a couple of fringe festivals. One was in Orlando. I think the other was in Tampa, although, don't hold me to that. I'm pretty sure it was Tampa. And he said, and this is true, he called the fringe festival, quote, which is like a sexual festival where they're doing all this stuff, end quote. And so I don't know if anybody watching this or listening to this has ever been to a fringe festival. I go pretty much every year. I'm in Orlando, so I go to one or two shows every year at the fringe festival. And to describe it as a sexual festival suggests to me that you have no earthly idea what a fringe festival is in real life. There are some like provocative shows, like in any kind of festival, there's like a whole range of stuff. But when I've gone to see like a one-man performance of the Star Wars trilogy or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I've gone to see puppet shows at the Fringe Festival. I went just a couple of years ago, someone dragged me to one that was, I don't even remember what it was about, but it involved a lot of audience participation and it was really awkward and uncomfortable. Nothing sexual about it. It was just awful. I would not have gone. I don't begrudge anybody who enjoyed it, but I wouldn't go to it again if I had known going in. But, there are, drag shows as part of this, which is really probably what Ron DeSantis is referring to when he talks about this. It's interesting, I would suggest, that he immediately associates a drag performance with a sexual festival thing. It's possible that says more about Ron DeSantis than it does about the Fringe Festival or drag performances. But anyway, that was the line he went with. He didn't want this going to sexual festivals. So fast forward to this week, he rolls out his new state budget. And this year, he actually included money for arts and cultural programs, nearly $30 million. Not quite as much as last year, but basically the same. Like to the point when people first got the state budget, it was sort of like surprising to see it in there. But of course, it came with strings because he wants to add new language into the budget and also into state law that would essentially give himself complete veto power over any arts and cultural project funded by the state. And specifically, that would allow him to block any funding for an arts program that, quote, that isn't appropriate for all ages. Basically, all programs funded by the state would have to be, quote, appropriate for all age groups, which is, again, a terrible way to fund arts programs. We don't expect all arts performances to be appropriate for all ages, for all people. There's going to be a whole diaspora of things. But Ron DeSantis wants to give him the power give himself the power to decide what arts programs in Florida can get funding and which cannot, And it sort of extends beyond this too. So this arts debate has probably gotten the most attention out of all the coverage and discussion of the governor's budget this week. But this same dynamic shows up in other places. I'll give you another example. So as part of the budget, there are also a bunch of what are often called implementing and conforming bills. They're like pieces of legislation, and they're changes to state law that are designed to sort of carry out what the budget funds. And so the governor has also proposed a bunch of changes to the state's various transportation laws, including one that would also give himself veto power over any research grants that the Florida Department of Transportation provides to state universities. Folks might be surprised to learn this, but the Department of Transportation spends a lot of money funding research, and this could be on, everything from remote controlled boats that are used to inspect bridges, evaluating sort of the vulnerability of various infrastructure, roads and other airports, that sort of thing, to sea level rise, developing traffic safety simulation software, that sort of thing. A lot of grants going out the door the last few years related to autonomous vehicles, that sort of thing. But as I was kind of Googling around to try and see what other stuff FDOT funds, I came across a recent study from Florida Atlantic University that was funded in part with a grant from the Florida Department of Transportation about exploring how income, race, and design affects pedestrian casualties. And the second you see race in there, you can just picture someone running to Ron DeSantis screaming DEI, and God forbid we understand why poorer communities might have different pedestrian challenges than other communities. And so, even though this hasn't got a lot of attention, I suspect that's what this is designed to stop, and probably any kind of funding that might be plausibly related to reducing greenhouse gases, that sort of thing. Ron DeSantis wants to be able to single-handedly kill any research grants like this. And just to also be clear here, all of this is done through appointees. So in the case of the arts programs, it would be the Secretary of State that gets to veto any arts program funding for any particular arts event or program that he doesn't want. In this case, the Secretary of the Florida Department of Transportation or the Board of Governors of universities would get to veto any research grants that they don't like. But these are all political appointees of the governor, direct political appointees of the governor. These guys, particularly when it comes to stuff like this, they don't do peep without the governor or his senior political and policy staff giving them a blessing to do so. And so then you get even beyond kind of this vetoing research and arts funding. He also wants a bunch of money to essentially interrogate petition campaigns. So the governor's budget includes something like $2.3 million in new funding for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to investigate petition fraud allegations. And all of this is designed to harass and stop ballot initiatives that the governor does not like. We saw this is exactly what played out last year. We've talked about this a ton of times on this podcast and in the newsletter. We've had a lot of writing about the governor's sort of unprecedented efforts to stop Amendments 3 and 4 last year. The Amendment 3, which would have legalized recreational marijuana in Florida, and Amendment 4, which would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban and prohibited government interference in abortion. A big part of the tactics they used to try and derail those was essentially sicking election police and inventing claims of fraud to try and discredit these amendments and to seed potential legal challenges to them. And if you're thinking to yourself here, well, obviously you want to investigate allegations of fraud, serious allegations of fraud. Sure, you do want to do that, except these allegations, these referrals come from the DeSantis administration itself. The Department of State is sending over these referrals to have FDLE investigate them. Essentially, they're able to invent and go after whatever they want under this setup. Like, I think about, we had a story just recently revisiting a law the legislature passed in Ron DeSantis last year, essentially gutting the state's ethics laws. And one of the ways it did that is it prohibited local ethics boards from independently initiating their own investigations into potentially corrupt politicians. Apparently we don't want ethics agencies from looking around themselves to potentially find stuff. So we didn't want it there, but in this case, we want the state to be able to launch its own petition investigations. And I guarantee you, all these investigations are going to be targeting amendments that the governor himself personally opposes. All of this is around sort of girding the state against future petition drives. We've already seen the marijuana folks are planning to try again in 2026. There's already in the works petition drive, a ballot initiative that would expand Medicaid health insurance in Florida. You can guarantee you that the governor will use this money, this petition fraud task force to harass and try and block those campaigns. And sort of similar, there's also a bunch of money in the governor's budget for, and I'm just scrolling through some notes here to make sure I get the right numbers. There's a whole bunch of money for more state propaganda. So I'll give you two examples in here. He wants $28.4 million from the state's opioid settlement trust fund, the money that we got from opioid manufacturers and distributors and retailers to try and abate the opioid crisis. He wants $28.4 million to spend on essentially anti-drug advertising, which would be a giant increase, almost a 50% increase from the current year budget. He also wants to triple the budget from $1 million to $3 million for the Agency for Healthcare Administration to advertise this healthcare transparency website. And the reason I single out these two pots of money is these appear to be two of the main sources of money that the governor used this past year when he launched all that taxpayer-funded advertising against Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. So he wants to be able to continue doing that. This budget gives him far more money to do that, to fund those kind of advertising efforts. Sort of related to all this, there's also more than $1 million in new funding in this budget to create something called an Office of Faith and Community within the governor's office to essentially coordinate activities with churches and religious groups around the state. As a quick aside, to talked about how sort of fundamentally unserious these budgets can be. One of the things Ron DeSantis loves to brag about in his proposed budgets is how he's reducing state employee counts. He's eliminating a bunch of jobs across state government because he's a big bad tough guy when it comes to spending. He does that because he knows the legislature won't follow through on the most damaging stuff of this. But when you actually drill down, his executive staff, his inner circle, he would increase that by almost 10%. A lot of this is for this Office of Faith and Community here. And the reason I single this out is this was yet again another tactic we saw in another part of the state campaign we saw particularly against Amendment 4, the abortion rights amendment, where the governor was actively coordinating and organizing strategy calls and disseminating talking points and arguments to anti-abortion groups and evangelical anti-abortion activists to try and get them to mobilize and activate and organize against Amendment 4. And if you look at what this Office of Faith and Community would do, because I mentioned the budget includes a bunch of bills that would sort of implement the budget. If you look at the piece of legislation creating the Office of Faith and Community, one of its key tasks would be to, quote, deliver relevant and useful information from the Executive Office of the Governor and state agencies to faith and community networks in Florida. Again, he's essentially retroactively legalizing a bunch of the illegal campaigning he did on state time against Amendments 3 and 4. We had a long story, and I'll throw it in the show notes just the other day about how a lot of his petition proposals, he wants to crack down and make it even harder to gather signatures, basically make it nearly impossible to gather enough signatures to put a ballot measure, a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot in the first place. But a central theme of that legislation is also designed to retroactively sanction a lot of the tactics he used against Amendment 3 and 4. And then another bucket to this whole kind of nanny state idea here is that he wants to control what people can learn in schools in a way, interfering in a more active way than we've ever seen elected officials historically do. And so I'll give you just a couple of examples out of the education budget. He wants $4 million, nearly $4 million to spend on a vendor that has been hired to develop they're calling it an online transparency tool. But what it is a system that's designed to make it easier for parents to get books removed from school libraries. I mean, this is, by the way, not me characterizing it. I've got emails where staffers have internally described this system, and the term they used was it as a system to help people, quote, limit access to library books in schools. That is the point of this tool. And this is another $4 million to what is apparently going to be a $15 million project overall. And of course, the vendor that has been hired to do this just happens to be represented by their lobbyist, happens to be one of Ron DeSantis' biggest fundraisers. So coincidence, I'm sure. In another place, he wants $700,000 for what they're calling a return on investment study to evaluate the benefits of university programs. And maybe that sounds harmless to you, but you should know this is happening as right now the DeSantis administration is preparing to launch an ROI study that compares a handful of degrees. And tell me, to see if you can tell me which one doesn't sort of fit with this. The list of degrees they're comparing to each other right now are finance, nursing, civil engineering, computer science, and women's and gender studies, right? This is clearly designed to be a study to give ammo to folks that just want to abolish gender studies across the state university system completely, right? They've already passed laws forcing universities to remove them from core programming, to make them solely elective classes and not elective, but make them solely classes that don't count towards the core credits you need in order to graduate, right? This is designed to further that initiative and just eradicate programs the governor does not like and disagrees with from the university system entirely. This is an attack on gender studies. It will also be an attack on all sorts of social studies. That is what that money is designed to do. And then just a couple other things. Sort of the counterpoint to this is the way the governor continues to prop up New College, which most of the folks listening to this probably are well aware of the story of New College, where a couple of years ago, right before launching his presidential campaign, the governor essentially initiated what is probably best described as a hostile conservative takeover of New College of Florida, the state's smallest public university, a traditionally liberal arts school. He imposed a bunch of hardline ideologues on the board of directors, who immediately gave the job to a politician who has served at Ron DeSantis' beck and call since he was elected. And they have since spent the last couple of years trying to turn New College into an explicitly conservative school along the model they keep referring to as Hillsdale College, which is a private a Christian school in Michigan. In fact, if memory serves, one of the trustees that Ron DeSantis put on the New College board when he took it over was someone from Hillsdale College. But the reason I single this up is when we talk about sort of what the usefulness of state budgets and the governor's recommended budget showing what they care about is Ron DeSantis is continuing to just dump money into New College, right? So this budget includes another $15 million funding increase for New College. So just to put that in perspective, 4 years ago, just before in the 2022-2023 budget, so the year before Ron DeSantis launched his takeover, the base funding for New College was around $30 million a year. Under the governor's budget now, it would be more than $70 million. It's essentially they've more than doubled funding for this school because they care about creating this giant, this conservative beacon, basically, an explicitly conservative school. And they're so committed to trying to make sure this is a success, they are throwing money at this. And so it's something to keep in mind the next time you hear a politician talking to you about how much they care about an issue, but our resources are finite. We can't sort of invest in everything. We've got to work smarter, not harder. No, when they really care about something, they throw a bunch of money at it because they know money matters. And this is not just a funding thing. Probably the other piece of the governor's budget that has gotten the most attention this week is the fact that he also wants to fold the Ringling Museum in Sarasota into New College, basically give that to New College. It's all about trying to build and build and build and turn New College into like a national magnet for conservatives. Just as another thing on there, there's also $3 million in the budget for a Freedom Institute at New College that would focus on combating cancel culture, right? The same governor that wants to be able to cancel any arts grant that he does not personally agree with wants to also give $3 million to his conservative college to build an institute devoted to canceling cancel culture. You cannot make some of this stuff up. And the last point I'll make about this is the sort of thing that Seeking Rent's most cares about is what the governor wants to do on taxes. And let me just sort of scroll down to the last batch of notes I have here. So as part of this budget, the governor has also proposed something like a little more than $1.5 billion worth of tax cuts, right? It's about $500 million in temporary tax cuts, about $1.7 billion. I'm sorry, yeah. So he's actually basically he's proposed more than $2 billion worth of tax cuts. About $500 million, about a quarter of that would be temporary, and then 1.7 roughly is permanent tax cuts, right? And what's interesting is how he wants to organize these tax cuts. The headline gimmick, the one he talked about the most, the one he's trying to get attention to was something called the Second Amendment Summer, which would basically be like a 6-week sales tax holiday, a 6-week period where there would be no sales tax on sales of guns and ammunition, essentially. This is a complete gimmick. Like all these temporary sales tax holidays, these do almost nothing to actually save consumers money. They just sort of shift spending around. They end up subsidizing retailers' advertising budget. That's essentially what you get is retailers either raise prices or do less discounting than they otherwise would during tax holidays because the state is providing the discount on their behalf. This is, by the way, this is like across political spectrum. Conservative economists hate tax holidays as much as liberal economists do. These are purely gimmicks. But that's where a lot of the attention was. But here are the two most important points to know about the governor's proposed tax cuts. First, every single tax break that would benefit consumers directly is temporary. There are no permanent tax breaks for consumers in the governor's budget. And two, The permanent tax cuts, as I mentioned, are $1.7 billion, nearly $2 billion of permanent tax cuts here. Almost every single cent of that, or no, I'm sorry, every single cent of that would go to businesses. Basically, there's two giant business tax cuts in here. One is reducing something called that the business lobby likes to call the commercial rent tax. And this is essentially sales tax gets charged on commercial lease payments. So when Publix leases space in a shopping center for a grocery store, it pays sales tax on its lease payments, or when Publix rents out space, if it owns the shopping center to the nail salon next door, the nail salon pays rent on that tax. And the business lobby has been trying to eradicate this tax, which is a major revenue source for years. And you hear a lot of politicians, Ron DeSantis included this week, will basically just ape business lobbyist talking points as if it's their own without any sort of critical thinking. So one thing you'll hear is that Florida is one of the only states that charges sales tax on commercial lease payments. That's true. Florida is also one of the only states that has no personal income tax, an outdated, easy to avoid corporate income tax, and loopholes that allow a bunch of businesses to avoid corporate income tax completely. But you don't ever see them trying to strengthen the corporate income tax or close those loopholes, even though Florida is an extreme outlier on that front too. Without getting too far into the weeds, but when you kind of match up Florida's corporate income tax with its lack of a personal income tax, it creates this gaping business tax loophole. Florida is one of only 2 states in the country that has this loophole. The other is Alaska. Yet nobody cares about closing that. But when it comes time, when we're an outlier in a way that businesses are paying taxes, suddenly that's the thing they all care about. So the other one here, the other big tax break, permanent tax break in the governor's budget is essentially a corporate income tax rate. And to as I mentioned, Florida has one of the easiest to avoid corporate income taxes in the country. Essentially, only 1% of all businesses pay any corporate income tax at all in Florida. So this tax break, even though it's being cast as as a venture capital thing and a thing to help startups, who this is going to save money for is giant corporations like Google and Bank of America and Walmart. All of these companies have their own sort of R&D developments and venture capital businesses and stuff. They're going to start getting tax breaks in Florida under this program if Ron DeSantis gets his way. So again, everything for consumers, temporary. Everything for businesses, permanent. I mean, it is just the classic sort of bait and switch of, look over here at my Second Amendment summer. Well, I give literally $2 billion to businesses, This is why it's sort of important to pay attention to this stuff because, they use the distractions of these culture wars, these social issues, all of this stuff to distract from the actual rent seeking that's happening. And there is a bunch of rent seeking in Ron DeSantis' budget. It's right there on paper. So anyway, we're going to cut it off right there. I'm going to probably be back again in a day or two just to do a little bit more discussion from some of the stuff happening in the Florida legislature. There's another week of committee hearings happening in advance of the session, which starts next week. So look for another podcast in the next day or two. But as always, if you're interested in this content, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. There's no paywall on anything, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you've got the means, please think about doing that. That the revenue we get from voluntary paid subscriptions is incredibly important, both paying for the work we do and also helping to ensure that we don't put a paywall up for everyone else. So if you got the means, please think about doing that. Also, we've got a YouTube channel where this and other video content will get posted. If you can, check us out over there and just subscribe. That is free, but just building that subscriber base is really helpful. Okay, that's it for now, and we'll be back again very soon. See ya. Bye-bye.